Hi students, welcome back. We're going to get into Chapter 2, Part 2. This is Part 2 of Exchange in East Asia and the Indian Ocean. Let's get started. All right, so our key terms today are going to take us through Malacca and all the way over into Japan and then finally into China. The lecture questions for today is is the importance of the Malacca Sultanate? How do East Asian societies interact with Europeans? And finally, how do East Asian dynasties create stability and define policy in the region? So we're going to begin today by talking about the Malacca Sultanate. And Malacca is an area that's located on that map. You can see highlighted here on the map in front of you with a very fine natural harbor. And it essentially was the primary main sea route between India and China, with India being to the west and China being to the east. It was founded by Paramasara, who was a Sumatran prince who had fled his native Sumatra under Javanese attack, and briefly established his kingdom in Singapore, and then later on settled in Malacca, the city right on the sea that now bears the name Malaccan Straits. Masara, who became a Muslim and took the title Sultan Iskandar Shah in 1414, established early tributary relations with the Ming China. And this is going to be really important, and you'll learn later in the lecture that the Ming Chinese had various tributary states that they helped protect, and they also had trading relationships with. So this benefited the Malacca Sultanate greatly, their relationship with China. The other thing that benefited them was this newly established trade with the West, with Europeans. By the 1430s, the city had become the preeminent commercial emporium in Southeast Asia. And it basically hosted local traders, it hosted Indian traders, Arab traders, Persian merchants, Chinese traders. It really became a crossroads. So it turns out that it becomes a very diverse population over time. Multiple languages were spoken there, and it becomes a very powerful sultanate because of the fact that it controlled these straits, this waterway. And they were able to collect taxes as a result of controlling the waterway. So to talk about Malacca's Sultanate culture, we have to talk about a Muslim culture. It was founded by a Muslim, and there was, however, a large Sufi influence in the city, and we will talk about the Sufis in a minute on the next slide. But when the Sultanate is established, there is a mass construction, as often happens in Muslim societies, of mosques and religious schools. And it becomes known as a place not just of trade, but also of learning as well. As time goes on and it becomes a more and more important waterway because of its crossroads situated, really between India and East Asia, foreigners will be coming through the straits more and more often, and particularly Europeans. And as a result of that, they decided to found something called the Udang Malacca Law, or the Law of Malacca. The clauses contained in the Udang Malacca cover an extensive area, taking up into account a wide variety of circumstances that would arise on a ship with respect to social issues such as slavery, adultery, murder, stealing, disrespecting an officer, and negligence in carrying out duties. Also, economic aspects such as tax and trade, including measurement and weight and area. The legal code also outlines a very well structured organization on the ships, with titles of officers are clearly specified, complete with their responsibilities. Um, and the Malacca and the city and also the waterway becomes known as being a very highly regulated, highly controlled waterway under these laws, and you could be punished if you did not obey these laws. You could even be executed if you did not obey these laws. So once you got into these waters, it was highly regulated, highly restricted. But as I said before, this was really the main route at the time, the most direct route from India over into Indonesia and China and Japan, at least coming from the Indian Ocean. And so people would have to put up with udang laws because that was the law of the land at the time. Malay becomes the primary language of this region, and Malay, this is really considered, the Malacca Sultanate is really considered sort of the pinnacle of Malay culture and history during this time period in the 15th and 16th century. So it's the dominant trading port in the region. A lot like Surat, it becomes a multicultural area that is a crossroads for a lot of different people from across the globe, especially as we get further and further along in history and international trading becomes more and more important. So, as these Muslim sultanates arise throughout India and over into Asia, in Malacca, in Indonesia, you're going to start to also see along with it the spread of Sufism. Sufism arose as an organized movement in Saudi Arabia after the death of Muhammad in 1632 CE. Um, Most of the Sufi movement was based on this belief that Orthodox Islam was too spiritually stifling. And instead, Sufis wanted to have a more direct experience of God, seeking divine knowledge and wisdom and divine love and wisdom of the world through various rituals. Probably the most famous of these rituals is the spinning dervishes or the whirling dervishes, the dancers who spin and meditate on God. And they're also known for their poetry, particularly their love poetry and their literature. One of the most famous Sufi poets is Jal al-Din Rami, who lived from 1207 to 1273 CE. And Rumi's poetry is even now today popular, and so it had a lot of influence in terms of poetry, in terms of ritual, and also in terms of literature generally. As I mentioned before, it's really sort of a break from the fundamentalist Orthodox beliefs of Islam, and so Sufis were sometimes ostracized in certain Orthodox Islamic communities. But on the other hand, they also made conversion to Islam appealing to many. So there were a lot of people that said, I might not like all of the rigidness of Orthodox Islam, but I like Sufism and I like this idea of having a direct personal experience with God. And in that way, the Sufis really made an impact in their mark on Muslim societies. So Malacca, being the pinnacle of Malay culture, enjoyed about a century of the Malaccan Sultanate being really the dominant force in the region. And then in 1509, a Portuguese fleet arrived in Malacca wanting to engage in trade, which of course they could have done, but that was not enough for them. They actually wanted to capture the Malacca and take it from the Sultanate and basically control the trade in the region. They really were wanting and hoping to replace Venice as the center of the spice trade in Europe. And so they were trying to make themselves the dominant spice brokers in Europe. And in order to do this, they felt as if they really had to control this very critical and important waterway. And so that actually leads to multiple years of fighting until in 1511 the Portuguese actually take possession of the city. And they establish themselves there for 130 years, from 1511 until 1641. In 1641, Dutch traders arrived, and they had actually created an alliance with some of the regional people, some of the people in the area, and so they were able to join forces with these their regional allies and take Malacca from the Portuguese. Dutch Malacca was the longest period that Malacca was under foreign control, and that period lasted from 1641 to 1825. The Dutch ruled for almost 183 years, with just a few intermittent British occupations during the French Revolutionary and later the Napoleonic Wars. This era saw relative peace in Malacca with little serious interruption from the Malay sultanates due to the understanding forged between the Dutch and the Sultanate of Johor in 1606. So early on, the Dutch understood that it was really important to have relationships with local leaders. So However, the period that the Dutch were in Malacca also marks the decline of Malacca's importance as a trading center, because the Dutch preferred what is now present-day Jakarta as their economic and administrative center in the region. Basically, they held Malacca to prevent the loss of the city to other European powers and the competition that could potentially go through it come from that. Thus, in the 16th, 17th century, with Malacca ceasing to be an important port, the Johor Sultanate became the dominant local power in the region due to the opening of its ports and the alliance with the Dutch. So the Portuguese, however, will not be deterred by the fact that the Dutch take control of Malacca. They continue into Indonesia, into China, and over to Japan to continue with not only their trading efforts, but also with their missionary work in the region. All right, on to talking about Ferdinand Magellan and his famous circumnavigation of the globe. So in 1519, Ferdinand Magellan, who was a Portuguese mariner and explorer, had asked the Portuguese to sponsor his circumnavigation of the globe. He was denied by the Portuguese, and a lot like Columbus, he decided to go to the Spanish to ask for sponsorship of his exploration. And he got it, and he left with a fleet of 5 ships and a crew of 270 men. And they departed for a westward route to Asia. So down across the Atlantic Ocean, along the coast of South America, around the bottom of South America, where he will name that body of water down there at the tip of South America, the Strait of Magellan, and then out across the Pacific, where he will eventually land in the Philippines. In the Philippines, the missionaries went to work, and actually Raja Humabam, who was the leader of in the Philippines at the time, the chief, and his wife agreed to convert to Christianity if Magellan helped him defeat one of his enemies. And as a result of Magellan agreeing to this, Magellan will be killed in battle by a poison arrow in 1521, leaving the rest of his men to continue on with the journey, which they do. However, only 18 of his men will eventually return to Spain under Captain Juan Sebastian Elcano's leadership. They arrived back in Spain in 1522. This circumnavigation of the globe was really important for a couple of reasons. The first is obviously that there was a lot of mapping that was done. It was proven that you could indeed circumnavigate the globe. But the other reason why it was important was because the Spanish the Philippines get put on the radar of the Spanish. And 50 years later, in 1571, the Spanish will successfully set up their colony in the Philippines. The Philippines becomes one of Spain's most lucrative colonies, and the reason for that is because Spanish silver from the Americas are being transported over to the Philippines and then being used as currency in China, because China was accepting only silver currency at that particular time. And so it becomes this very lucrative and very strategic geographically position for the Spanish Empire. So now we're going to turn to talking about Japan in the 14 and 1500s. And during this century, Japan is really experiencing a lot of internal strife. This strife is primarily between the Ashikaga shoguns, who are like military overlords or generals, kind of top brass, I guess, and the samurai. And the samurai are local, more regional leaders who are trying to impose their own rule. And out of this chaos in the 1560s come three powerful samurai who come out as leaders that are going to unite, and in fact they're called the Three Unifiers. The first is Oda Nobunaga, and he starts to unite Japan under his rule. He was succeeded by Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. And these three leaders really become the model of leadership moving forward. This is going to be really important because as Japan, just like every other place in Asia at this time, Japan is soon going to come in contact with foreigners, right? And so it was very important that Japan be united, that the violence internally was ended, and that they had a strong central government that would be able to define their relationship and their nation and their relationship with the West. So in the 1540s, the Portuguese arrive in Japan and bring with them Christian missionaries, Christian Catholic missionaries, and they were followed soon after by the Spanish. Initially, they had a pretty good success rate, and in fact, in the city of Nagasaki, it was the most Christianized community in Japan and had 10 churches. And a lot of the missionaries were able to convert people because they actually learned how to speak Japanese, and that was a way for them to be able to speak and communicate with their converts. Most samurai, however, were not interested in becoming Roman Catholics, but they were interested in something else the Europeans had to offer, and that was weapons, or guns in particular. So many of the samurai would become Christian or offer their missionary support in an effort to obtain weapons and gunpowder to assist them in their battles with other rival samurai. Oda Nobunaga Oda Nobunaga, who we talked about on the last slide, made use of this new style of fighting. And in 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, he and his vassal Tokugawa Ieyasu used companies of samurai armed with European guns to defeat the warriors of the Takata clan. And so even though he was assassinated, Oda was assassinated in 1582, he had unified the central portion of the main Japanese island of Honshu, including the area surrounding Kyoto, which was the seat of the emperor and of the power. Hideyoshi, who is the next in line, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a vassal of Oda's, succeeded him in his position after defeating that army. And by 1590, Hideyoshi had defeated all of the samurai in Japan and required that they declare their loyalty to him. Unlike Nobunaga, who had been relatively unconcerned with the activities of the Christians, Hideyoshi was more suspicious of them. And he was a devout Buddhist. He didn't like the fact that the Christians ate cows and horses. He was horrified by the fact that the Christians would destroy the Buddhist temples and objects of worship, and they would encourage their converts to do the same. So in 1587, Hideyoshi ordered the missionaries to leave Japan. But in fact, that never happened fully, because most of the Christians ignored the order, and many of the missionaries continued to support the Christianized samurai. So Japanese Christians, Hideyoshi despised them after a while and ordered the arrest of missionaries who had remained in Japan of his 1587 order. So in 1587, Hideyoshi says all Christians must leave. The order is largely ignored. And then 10 years later, in 1597, he orders that a bunch of Christians be rounded up. 26 of Christians were rounded up, arrested, and they were crucified in Nagasaki. They become known as the 26 martyrs, Christian martyrs in Japan. So that's despite the fact that there was martyrdoms, obviously, of these Christians that had been killed, by 1600 there was more than 100,000 Japanese who continued to say that they were Christian. So after Hideyoshi's after Hideyoshi dies, Tokugawa Ieyasu comes to power, and he comes to power in 1600 when there is about 100,000 Roman Catholics there. And in 1614, Ieyasu basically outlaws the practice of Christianity, and orders all of the missionaries to leave the country. So Tokugawa Ieyasu basically is the final of the three unifiers, and he is going to be the one that will bring this long period of peace and prosperity to Japan. This included, high levels of literacy, supporting a thriving publishing culture, and a whole cultural blossoming. He moves the capital from Kyoto to Edo, which will eventually become Tokyo. And there was a lot of, leisure activities that were created in the capital, including restaurants and theaters. and lots of Shinto shrines and things like that for people to visit. So after this period of unrest and this interaction with the West and with Christianity in particular, the Tokugawa period will emerge in 1600 and will bring on a period of peace and prosperity. So, as I mentioned in the last slide, in 1598, Hideyoshi dies and is succeeded by his vassal Tokugawa Ieyasu. And Tokugawa is going to form the most powerful shogunate, right? And it's even an entire era, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. As I mentioned before, he moves the capital from Edo to Tokyo. And he was very suspicious of the Christians. That's the reason why he expelled all of the Christians from Japan in 1614. He felt as if they were undermining the authority of the shogunate. And he was just generally suspicious of foreigners overall. And so he decides that the best way to keep the foreigners out of the country was to ban the entry of foreigners into the country completely, and then also forbid any Japanese from leaving the country. This would also prevent perhaps other samurai from conspiring against him with other countries. So this kind of worked both ways, and it worked in his mind to his advantage. He understood, however, the importance of having some type of contact with the outside world. And so in order to continue to have some kind of a touch point to the outside world, he decided that the Dutch were the least offensive of all of the European nations, primarily because the Dutch had refrained from missionary activity. And so they were still allowed to enter Japanese, particularly just specifically to trade. Dutch merchants, however, were confined to a settlement on Dejima Island in the harbor of Nagasaki. They were not able to leave this island. You can see an image of it there. It was a walled compound, and they were not allowed to leave the island. They could only deal with licensed trade officials and translators, people whom the Tokugawa shogunate trusted. And so the Chinese merchants were still allowed to enter the country, but their trade was also confined to Nagasaki. And if they lived in Nagasaki, which they were allowed to do, they were forced to live in a special Japanese enclave. So this was the way in which the Japanese and the Tokugawa decided to deal with some of the stresses that were being caused by this new international trade and exploration that was being done by the Europeans. Their solution was basically just to shut it down completely. There was one way in which Japanese were still able to kind of get informed of what was going on in Europe, and this became known as Dutch learning, which was basically sort of the leak of Dutch books into Dutch books and culture, really leaked into Japan by way of these Dutch traders. And this really kept the Japanese at least informed of what was happening in Europe, even if they weren't directly engaging in any of the events that were taking place. Okay, moving on to talk about China and the founding of the Ming Dynasty in 1368. So just a quick background, China has had 13 dynasties in total, starting in 2070 BCE. and lasting all the way until 1911. Um, and we're going to talk about the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty was founded in 1368 by Emperor Hongwu, also known as Taizu. And he was born into a peasant family. And he is actually one of only two Chinese emperors that came from a peasant family, that came from poverty. The other one being Liu Bang, who founded the Han Dynasty back in 202 BCE. So it was quite unusual for a peasant to rise to the status of emperor, but Hongwu was involved in military campaigns that eventually pushed back and defeated the Mongols. So that's how he was able to rise to political prominence. In 1371, the Ming decide that they are going to forbid all private foreign trade in China. This is partly in response to the growing trading networks and the growing concern that there could potentially be foreign influence, that there could potentially be tax evasion as a result of private trade directly with foreigners. And so this is a way for the Chinese to kind of close down and monitor and isolate and control the administration of their tax code, etc. Basically, they wanted only to protect and interact with their vassal states. So we talked about Chinese vassal states before when we were talking about Malacca. Remember, Malacca became a Ming vassal state, and these are states that they trust, that they have decided to protect, and that they also have close trading partnerships with, and that they know that they can get their tax revenue from. These changes, however, will eventually negatively impact China's tax revenue. That doesn't happen immediately, but eventually it will. And eventually it will lead to China sort of having to open up its trading partnerships. But more on that later. Okay, so now we're going to go and move on to talk about Emperor Zhu Di Yongle. Emperor Zhu Di, also known as the Yongle Emperor, will hire under him a he's the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He is very curious about the outside world. He wants to get reports of what's happening across the seas. And so he decides that he is going to hire a Muslim eunuch by the name of Zheng He to carry out a series of voyages into the Indian Ocean. There was a couple of reasons why he did this. Obviously, curiosity, but also sort of a practical, more political reason was to really show the power and the influence of the Ming Dynasty, the power, the wealth of the Ming Dynasty. He also was looking for more vassal states, wanting to gain more trading partnerships, and wanting basically to collect more tax revenue. So between 1405 and 1421, Shang He will carry out a series of 6 voyages out into the Indian Ocean. These were incredibly impressive voyages with these massive ships that could hold lots of goods for trade and bring lots of goods back, including a giraffe, which was brought back to Africa for the emperor. So here we have this incredible image of Zheng He's ships, or one of his ships, um, next to Columbus's Santa Maria. And you can just see the scale of these gigantic Chinese ships compared to these small Spanish vessels. And it just really gives you a perspective of how impressive Zhang He's ships must have been as they floated, into an Arabian port or into an Indian port or into an African port. So here we see a map of Zheng He's voyages out of China, and you can see that he's going all around the Malay Peninsula, over to India, over to the Arabian Peninsula, and even as far as Africa. So let's talk about Ming China some more because this is a very important period in Chinese history. First, the capital is moved to Beijing, and basically there is a code created, a law code that is created that is meant to consolidate Chinese law and to centralize Chinese law. This is known as the Great Ming Code. It was also known as Da Ming Lu. Passed in 1397. This code had 460 articles organized by sections on personnel, revenue, rights, military affairs, penal affairs, and public works. The code was also meant to achieve and maintain an idealized social hierarchy, so that punishments were most severe for those who transgressed their superiors. So there's a very hierarchical system. And they really wanted to consolidate social stability. So basically, the code itself was considered to be the largest and most rationally organized system in the world. The government was divided into parallel military and civil hierarchies, where civil officials were recruited through traditional examination systems, and military officials were recruited through a combination of examinations and hereditary. The Yongle Emperor consolidated power quickly through this system of hierarchy. He established military escorts for imperial princes and moved the capital to Beijing, as I've already mentioned. Yongle oversaw the building of the Forbidden City, the home of all Chinese emperors until the end of the China's dynasties in 1911, and one of China's, of course, most iconic structures. To supply Beijing with grain, the Grand Canal was brought up over western Shandong through a series of 15 locks. So there's this massive canal that is built in order to bring grain and to bring food into this new capital city. This was a huge engineering accomplishment. A flotilla of 15,000 boats worked by 160,000 soldiers oversaw the transport of goods from south to north and north to south. So in order to bolster his legitimacy domestically and to enhance China's standing internationally by demonstrating China's wealth and power overseas, Yongle created what was the largest naval fleet in the world. And that was, of course, the one where Zheng He went out onto his expeditions to Arabia, to Africa, to India. Yongle also personally led 5 military campaigns into Mongolia, where he was eventually killed. But after his death, Ming power was never again projected into Mongolia, and the Ming defense policy against the northern barbarians shifted instead to a reliance on static walls, fortifications. For example, the Great Wall, of course, or the Great Wall of China, was um, built and rebuilt and extended during this period. For many of the most famous sections that still exist today were created during this time period as well. In 1577, the Chinese will allow the Portuguese to build a factory at Macau, and trade in Spanish silver will also become common. So by 1577, they're starting to open up some of their trading policies, particularly as it relates to Europeans. However, lavish spending, income inequality will eventually lead to the downfall of the Ming, because the people were unhappy, and the Ming, especially the emperors, were famously wealthy. So, as I mentioned, the lavish spending and the political instability of the Ming Dynasty really ultimately led to their downfall. But one thing that the Ming did have going for them is that they were able to build up a population, a very strong population in China. Under the Ming Dynasty, the population in China went from 60 to 80 million to between 150 and 200 million. So that was quite significant. But infighting, the introduction of foreigners and foreign trade, ultimately led to instability, which led to a power vacuum, which allowed then the Manchu to come in and take over, and basically establish the last dynasty in China, the Qing dynasty. This dynasty will last from 1644 to 1911. The Manchus were foreigners, essentially, from northeastern China that came from an area known as Manchuria. And they came down, they invaded from the north, came down, and eventually, like I said, will take over the Ming and establish their own dynasty. So by 1683, all of China was under Manchu control. Trade will continue, and Christianity was allowed with certain restrictions. And in fact, Christianity might have actually thrived more than it did in China if it wasn't for the fact that there was a series of papal bulls, like decrees that were issued from 1704 to 1742, that basically said that any of the missionaries in China could not allow the Chinese converts to perform any of their traditional Chinese rites. And so that ended up excluding a lot of people who wanted to continue to have continue on their cultural traditions. So the Qing dynasty essentially adopted the form of government that was used during the Ming dynasty, with only a few minor adjustments. The form of military organization that the Qing used was one of the best in the world at the time. They organized their troops under banners, each of which was a separate unit, and these fighters, these soldiers, were essentially owned by the emperor, were incredibly loyal to him. And so that really created a sense of loyalty and unity, at least between the government and the military. The Qing were very successful foreign rulers in China, but they always maintained their own identity, their own foreign identity. For example, they spent their summers, even the emperor would spend their summers in the homeland of Manchuria, which was essentially closed to the Chinese. They actually banned intermarriage between the Manchu and the Chinese, and they continued to speak their own language. And in some cases didn't make some of the documents even available to the Chinese. They also changed the Chinese way of dress and fashion. They required Chinese men to shave their heads and wear the queues, which are basically the long ponytail down the back. They required them to wear Manchu clothes. Chinese women were forbidden to bind their feet, which was actually a very old Chinese tradition. However, this was not something that they could actually enforce with any degree of certainty. So this period, the Qing period, allowed for growth in all areas. And there was a lot of maintenance that had to be done. And on public works, taxes were lighter than they were during the Ming period. And so the people were happier with the Manchu rule. Things like porcelain become big hallmarks of trade under the Manchu. Um, and European missionaries were allowed into China, and were actually influenced with Chinese ideals, as I already mentioned, but they were really limited in terms of their growth. The non-Chinese were allowed to reside in Macau, but after 1759, they could conduct trade only through the port of Guangzhou. And Confucian principles were embraced, and Confucian principles meaning sort of a more embracement of a more secular form of society, really keeping sort of a religion on one end and politics and governance on the other. And there was a real sense amongst the Chinese during the Qing dynasty, and even to a certain extent during the Ming dynasty, of Chinese superiority. And there wasn't really a whole lot that they felt that the West could really offer them. All right. So yes, this is a longer video, but we're finally at the end. So just to summarize, chapter 2, so we're talking about areas in the Indian Ocean and East Asia. We've established that there are very diverse and sophisticated societies that thrived in this region. And even though the Europeans did begin to make some headway into these areas in the late 15th century and early 16th century, they really didn't have the type of cultural influence that maybe they would have hoped. Some Christian missionaries made headway, but in general, rulers of the region just viewed the Europeans with suspicion. They tried to control and limit their trading capacity, primarily to the coastline, in order to maintain their autonomies as a state. Most of the contact with the West was solely for trading purposes. So not a lot of, even though there inevitably will be cultural exchange, there wasn't a lot of adaptation of Western culture in these regions. And finally, these regions are heavily influenced by strong, influential kingdoms and dynasties and sultanates. And we are going to see moving forward that these regions of the world, although they have been trading amongst themselves for quite some time, are now going to be forced to deal with a more heavy European presence in this part of the world moving forward. All right, that's it. See you later. Bye.